Hi, my name is Cami Cotler, and I played Elizabeth on the Waltons, and we're going to be making a little video talking about The Foundling, which was the first episode of the Waltons TV series ever aired. It's The Foundling. We're panning over what is Fraser Park. Fraser Park's about 2 hours north of Los Angeles, some sort of mountainy area. You can see lots of pines. It doesn't look like Virginia at all. We used to go there about twice a year and film, and they would take lots of extra stock footage to use for things like this. This episode's written by John McGreevy. He was maybe one of the first screenwriters that I noticed. I recognized his style. He always had a really clear plot and subplot. That's my memory of it anyhow. And it was with his scripts that I became conscious that the grown-ups have the plot and the kids have the subplot. John McGreevy was a lovely gentleman. Grew up in the countryside, just like Earl Hamner, the show creator. And I think writing these episodes, he talked about it later on, that writing these episodes was a real pleasure for him, because he got to write about things he'd grown up with. By the time he wrote this in 1972, he'd already been working as a screenwriter for about 20 years in Hollywood. So he was an experienced master of the craft. And I think he enjoyed writing our show. That was always the impression he gave me. But again, another lovely Southern gentleman. This episode was directed by Vincent Sherman, who I remember working with. He only did about 4 of our shows, I think. For some reason, as a child, I'd wonder what happened to the early directors, where did they go? Being a child, it wouldn't have occurred to me to ask anybody. It was all just sort of magical. It just kind of happened. But Vincent Sherman, again, really experienced gentleman. He'd been working for 30 years already in Hollywood as a director. He'd done a bunch of features and worked with people like Errol Flynn and Debbie Reynolds. Joan Crawford, all people who I didn't really understand who they were, and therefore couldn't ask Vincent Sherman to tell me any fabulous stories about the old movie stars that he'd worked with. But he was yet another person who was kind of coming out of that old Hollywood tradition, as was our director of photography, who'd worked with Orson Welles and Douglas Sirk, and was treated with real deference by all the actors and the crew. I think if you consider the look of our show, one of the real keys to it was having a director of photography who was old school and was really comfortable playing with shadows and bright contrasts, as opposed to the maybe flatter kind of consistent look that you get in a lot of 70s television programming.
When I was growing up during the Depression, I lived with my red-headed brothers and sisters, my parents and grandparents,
and here's Earl Hamner
at the
doing
foot of
the
a
narration.
mountain which had been in our family for generations.
So Earl Hamner was our show's creator. It's based on his life growing up in rural Virginia with 3 brothers and 3 sisters. Notice one extra family member than the Waltons. Earl was the eldest son, and he grew up with a father who worked as a stone cutter in the local soapstone factory, and his mom in a tiny house in central Virginia. And he was indeed somebody who wanted to be a writer and grew up to be the first in his family to go to college. Became a writer and a journalist, and had worked in Hollywood for some years before The Homecoming was made. And again, The Homecoming is based on his novella, The Homecoming, which I'd encourage anybody to read. It's quite sweet. Earl was a story editor on our show, so he was always around as a resource to make sure that the stories were consistent. When a writer wrote a screenplay for the Waltons, they would also work with Earl to make sure that the branding and the tone and the feel was consistent across the episodes. They looked for a narrator to play the voice of John Boy as a man, and couldn't really find anybody they liked. I think at some point in time, one of the producers said, why don't we just have Earl do it? And Earl has a fabulous old Central Virginia accent, with those vowels that come down from the Scots-Irish who originally settled in Central Virginia. So you have this whole class of sturdy people from Scotch-Irish stock working the mountainous Blue Ridge to try to feed their families and make a living. And that's really where this tradition comes out of, and that's where his accent comes from. So when you hear him say things like house instead of house, It comes from that lineage. All things I didn't know at age 7. So we have the setup. In comes this woman who is poorer than the Waltons, right? We can tell from her clothes, and she's carrying this bundle. The actress is Charlotte Stewart, who went on to be Mrs. Beadle in Little House on the Prairie. So that was about 3 years after we filmed this. And she's laying Holly down on our root cellar, which was a terrific place to play that actually did open up and you could walk down into it and close it behind you, which I found to be very dramatic as a city kid. Now we're inside the house, so we're on stage 26. If you notice, the camera won't really show the ceiling because there was no ceiling. There's a walkway all the way around that set with lights on it. And the walls to the right of Will right now, where the wiring board would be, is removable. So that's where the camera can be. Right now the camera is in the living room, shooting into the kitchen. And you'll notice that there's no, there's no tablecloth on the table. And there wasn't for the first year or so. And that came in later, that green and white tablecloth. Richard is barefoot, which also was something that dropped out after the first year or so. That table is in the wrong place. So that little table with the meat grinder is far to the right of the set. Normally it's much closer onto the to the stove. John Boy comes out the side. I think all the noises with the screens were actually recorded live, because those screens were noisy. And now Michael pulls the covers back so we can see Erica's face.
Honey.
Erica was about my age, so about 7.
What's your name,
honey? It was
honey?
a treat for me to have somebody my age on set to play with. She came back later and acted in the Waltons again as an unrelated character, sort of a mean girl.
John Boy, carry her inside.
Was mean to Elizabeth maybe when we were 13. If you notice around this, the set dressing here is different than it normally would be. There's a weird bin or like tub behind Richard where he's standing. There's a basket hanging on the wall outside the door, and all that went away. Okay, now we're back inside. We're back inside the kitchen. So the kitchen is a set that's super familiar to me, right? These kitchen scenes took a long time to film. So we spent most of our time on this kitchen set. We are not in our right places, which is also indicative of the fact that this is an early episode. Eventually, we all settled and had seats that we would not move from. And occasionally a new director would come and arrange, go to block a scene and have us tell them, you sit there and you sit there and you sit there. And we would say, no, that's not where I sit. And it was always quite a shock to a new director that the actors were refusing to go where he'd planned to put us. But we were pretty invested in the idea that we had our places at the table, and that's how families work. You have your places at the table and you don't randomly change them. It was one of the many ways I think that the actors on the Waltons were invested in the show and really felt a sense of ownership. That was modeled by the adults. This idea that we were caretakers of the characters and that we should say things and defend them. If you look at the table, you can see there's a really strange thing in the middle of the table. It looks like it holds condiments. Again, there's a piece of set dressing that I don't remember ever seeing again. So the way this would work is the set dressers would come in and they'd set up the physical pieces of the set, anything that wasn't really actively used. So the portraits you see hanging on the wall, the calendar hanging on the wall, the dresses dummy, all those things typically just stayed on set. They were always there. So as a child, if they weren't filming on the set, you could go play with stuff as long as you put it back where it belonged. And I did. And then the other pieces, like the milk pitcher, the glasses, the cups, those are all brought in by the prop master. So the prop master is in charge of things that are actively used in a scene, things that an actor is going to put their hands on. And the prop master is also in charge of the food. So right off set, there was a little, it's like a room that they built for a kitchen, but I don't think it had a roof or a ceiling. It was just one of the many structures on the inside of the stage where the prop man would make whatever food we had to eat for a scene, and then he would keep kind of reheating it and bringing it out for all the subsequent takes. Thanks for watching this part of Cami Narrates the Foundling. If you want to know when the next part is uploaded, go ahead and click on the little bell, and that will make sure that YouTube notifies you when we've uploaded the next part. Hope you enjoyed it.